So the first fort was built in 1755 by John Ashby and his Rangers. This was shortly after Braddock's defeat up near what's modern-day Pittsburgh. And Braddock had come over with his army of 1,500 men, and they really thought it was going to be a slam dunk. They thought they would take Fort Duquesne, and that would be sort of the end of the French and Indian War. And that is not what happened.
As we explore the history of the United States, we often find an interconnected web of progress that led to the institution of our great nation. The Battle of Fort Necessity was the starting point to the 7 Years' War we now call the French and Indian War. Hostilities between the French and British culminated in removal of the British from Fort Duquesne in subsequent defeat and surrender of Colonel George Washington at Fort Necessity. To counter the encroachment by the French, General Braddock and 2 British regiments were summoned to expel the French from Fort Duquesne. On May 9th, Braddock arrived at Fort Cumberland. He began his march to Fort Duquesne on June 7th, 1755, and was defeated by a much smaller force of French and Indians on July 9th, 1755. Immediately after General Braddock's defeat, the French and Indians began their reign of terror on the western frontier. Among the first to experience the death and destruction were the settlers located in the lower Patterson Creek Valley. On October 27, 1755, Colonel George Washington directed Lieutenant John Bacon of Maryland Independent Company to erect 2 forts in the valley to protect the residents and form the first line of defense against the marauding Indians. As directed by Colonel Washington, the site of one of these forts was to be on the plantation of either Charles Keller or James McCracken of the land grants issued by Lord Fairfax in 1748. The site chosen was the Lot 16, or otherwise known as Keller's Lot, which was adjacent to the main road leading to the mouth of Patterson Creek. A 90 by 90 stockade with bastions, a barracks, and storehouses was built. Construction of the fort was completed in late November 1755. Captain John Ashby of the Virginia 2nd Company of Rangers was initially placed in charge of the fort. The fort was initially manned by Ashby's Rangers, which consisted of 2 officers and 32 enlisted men. Among the enlisted men was Daniel Morgan, who would achieve fame during the Revolutionary War. The soldiers of the fort engaged in numerous skirmishes with the Indians. By late 1756, most of the settlers in the valley had either been killed or fled east to a safer location.
Super famous then, but during the Revolution, he was a major character in that war. He was first a major. He was really instrumental for the win at Saratoga.
Okay.
And that was a really important battle because up until then, France was reluctant to get into the war and help the burgeoning colonies because they hadn't won anything yet. But as soon as they won Saratoga, the money started to flow, the weapons and the powder came over, some cannons came over, and that really helped turn the tide. Then towards the end of the war, he had actually retired in the middle of the war. He had some ailments, his back was a mess, and he had some things, and he just went home. But Washington wrote to him towards the end of the war and said, the British are running wild in the South. I'm up here in New England. I need someone I can trust to help me, with the British down there. So he agreed, and he came back into the war, and he went down to North Carolina, and there was a British major running around named Bannister Tarleton, and he was creating a lot of havoc through the countryside, burning towns, burning homes, destroying crops, just creating a lot of havoc. And so Morgan brought his men down there, and he found a piece of ground near where Tarleton was that he loved. He could just instantly see this battlefield in his mind. And there were some hills where he could hide a lot of his troops behind. So he had this plan, and there were some scouts who went out and ran away from Tarleton, but not too fast, so that he would follow. And they led him right into this trap. And it was a brilliant plan. They still study it in the War College today, which blows my mind because this is, 250 years ago. But so it's a brilliant plan. And what happened is Tarleton got away with a few of his men, but they captured 800 men. So it was a huge victory. So Tarleton was forced, they basically started to retreat, and they ended up in Yorktown. And then that's the end of the war. The British got trapped. They had no way to escape. They had to surrender. And otherwise we'd be speaking with a different accent. Right. So, yeah.
I think that's true.
So he was just amazing. After the war, when Washington was president, he was called up to service again when the Whiskey Rebellion happened in Pennsylvania. And in fact, he raised 1,500 troops. And on his way up to Pennsylvania, he actually brought them to here because he was familiar with Ashby's Fort. Having served here, they camped for the night, and then they went on to Fort Cumberland and then into Pennsylvania. So he was here again. Then he became a one-term congressman before his health declined, and he passed away just a couple years later. But hugely important. Washington didn't like his tactics. I think he learned his tactics while he was here by watching what the Indians did. So I'll give you several examples. In the Revolutionary War, he insisted his men use rifles. Now, rifles existed. They were fairly commonplace, but in the military, they didn't use rifles very often. They used muskets. There's a few reasons for that. Muskets are smooth bore, like a shotgun, and when the bullet or the lead ball travels down the barrel, it's literally bouncing on the way down because it's much smaller than the barrel. So it has room to bounce. Whatever it hits last, it's going to bounce in the opposite direction when it's leaving the barrel. So muskets are only accurate to about 60 yards. So you can aim straight at someone. Now, if they're 60 yards or less, you have a good chance of hitting the person. But otherwise, it's going to go left, right, up, down. It could be anywhere. So why didn't everybody use rifles? Well, the problem with a rifle is the ball has to fit snugly into the gun so that the grooved rifling will put a spin on the ball. It's the spin on the ball that makes it so accurate. It's centrifugal force, and it just makes it go in a straight line. So you're accurate. If you're a good shot, and a lot of these guys were great shots because that's how you put dinner on the table. So a rifle could be accurate to 300 to even 400 yards, whereas a musket, 60 yards. Big difference. But because that ball was so tight in the barrel, that after you fired the gun a few times, when the gunpowder explodes, it leaves a lot of residue inside the barrel. So you have to clean your rifle probably every 5 or 6 shots. You're having to clean your rifle. But nobody wants to do that on the battlefield, right? Mm-hmm. With bullets whizzing around, the last thing you want to be doing is, just cleaning your rifle. So he came up with a technique, which is brilliant. He put all of his men on horseback. So they were mounted. They had rifles. He wouldn't accept anybody with a musket. And he trained his men to aim at the enemy that were wearing gorgets. And a gorget is a little metal piece, just like the one on the Frenchman back there, that signifies that you're an officer. Now, back then, it was ungentlemanly to shoot at officers. You just didn't do that. But Morgan knew if you kill all the officers, the soldiers aren't going to know what to do because they're used to following the orders of the officer. So that's what they were trained to do. So if you kill the officers, the men up front eventually just don't know what to do, and they retreat. They run back. Now, Washington was not happy with this because it went against the sort of the rules of conventional warfare at the time. But Morgan stood his ground. He says, "Well, sir, do you want to win?" And it was just that blunt. But
Facts, yeah.
But Washington thought for a minute. He says, "Okay, just don't tell me. Just do it. Just I don't want to know." So he was very successful with his tactics. He would send his men up. They would shoot at the officers, and then they would retreat. Then they'd go up, shoot some more, and retreat. And when they retreated, they had time to clean their rifles, and they're way out of range of anybody shooting. So it was brilliant, and it worked. And when the British surrendered at Saratoga, the commanding officer for the British wanted to know who was that officer that came around on our right flank. And Washington told him. In fact, Morgan was standing right nearby. He said, "It's this man, Daniel Morgan." He says, "I've never seen such brilliant tactics on a battlefield. You're to be commended." So that was high praise coming from your enemy that just surrendered.
Yeah, really. Yeah.
So, yeah. Before the war, Morgan was a wagoner. And so we set up some just things, normal, typical things that he'd be delivering across the Virginia countryside. So a wagoner back then is sort of like a truck driver today, just delivering supplies to different little towns and hamlets all across Virginia. And it could be anything. And then he would pick up raw supplies, raw materials from those places and bring them back towards Williamsburg, which was the capital, or any eastern port, and they would be shipped off to England to be used there. So raw materials being things like timber, coal, just raw materials. They ship them back, oftentimes in barrels. Well, not timber, but you put other things in barrels. That was a very common way to ship just about anything.
By late 1756, most of the settlers in the valley had either been killed or fled east to a safer location. This was in large part due to the fierce opposition taken by an Indian warrior named Bemino.
Bemino, and Delaware Indian, and he's just a really amazing character. He was super effective in this area. After just a few months, there were no people living in this area whatsoever. Mm-hmm. They had built these forts partially to help the local settlers have a place to come if the Indians came, or the French. But after a few months, there were no people. It was just the Rangers themselves. They had all either been killed or driven back east. They burned every plantation along this valley just a couple weeks before they started building this fort. Okay. So the people, and they would kill the men. The women and children they would capture, and they took them back to the Ohio country, where they would live in the tribe and help gather food and do chores around there. That was a common Indian practice they had used for thousands of years. If they were battling other tribes, they would capture people from the other tribe and bring them back to live and grow up in their tribe. So they were just continuing a practice that had been done for generations. We wanted to be accurate with Bemino's display. There are no known paintings of Bemino from that time period, but there are paintings of other Delaware Indians from that time period. So we took a look at all of those and borrowed heavily. It was very common for Indians to barter and trade with their furs, and they would get things that they couldn't make themselves, including these shirts. They would get English shirts. This one actually probably came from India, because India had figured out how to make these check patterns, whereas the English weren't making them at this point in time. But that's how trade went worldwide, and people don't know that back then in the mid 1700s, you could get stuff from all over the world. So this was common to be able to get this. These are German armbands. They're made out of silver. They don't really serve as a functional piece of adornment. It's just bling. It's just jewelry. Same with these. These are kind of blanket pins or kerchief pins. But the Indians didn't use them. They didn't use kerchiefs. They used them just as decoration. And some Indians would put one on for every man that he had killed in battle. But others just said, no, give me 20 of those, and and just decorate. Yeah. They were very decorative people. It took a lot of time to make these. There's no function to this. It's just a decorational piece on the end of this rope. He could have just tied a knot in the end of the rope and been done with it. Yeah. But they're very decorative. So they got silver from trading. This is deer fur that they dyed red, and then they would use different color threads to wrap around the rope. So simple to make, but very decorative. They would make these, they would sew these. These beads are glass beads that they traded for. Europeans had these glass beads, and before they had contact with the Europeans, Indians would find little shells in streams, and they would gather as many as they could. They would drill little holes in them, and then they would bead them together and decorate whatever article of clothing they're working with. That's really time consuming, right? Now you can take a deer skin and plop it on the table and say, I want a bag of beads. And that's a great trade for them. It takes no time at all with these modern beads that they already have holes. They're very uniform in size, so they can decorate anything they want with those. So they traded a lot for beads. They would have traded for anything metal. So this is a metal knife with a bone handle. This is sharp, and they could use this everyday use or during battle. Same with their tomahawk, a very sharp blade, but it was very useful around camp as well. So, but during battle, they would paint themselves almost exclusively red and black. And we found portraits of them painted that way. They would not paint themselves red and black for other occasions. So back in the tribe, if they're not at war, if they're celebrating someone's a birth or a marriage or something like that, they would paint themselves in different colors, but brighter colors, not red and black. Red and black was exclusively for war. So kind of interesting stuff. And it was pretty common, if they took a scalp, they would attach it to a wooden ring and take it back to camp. Or they would take it back. The British and the French would pay Indians for scalps of the enemy. So the French were paying the Indians quite a bit to bring back English scalps. All the colonists were considered English at that time, even if you might be Dutch or some other nationality originally. But if you lived in the colonies, you were considered English. Okay. So there's lots of stories about Bemino, but he's fascinating. This is the type of tomahawk that they used before Europeans came along. Made out of stone, lashed to a wooden handle, and they would sharpen it the best they could. But I can promise you, this is not sharp. Now, if in battle, if someone struck it really hard against my head, I'm probably going to be killed. It's a rock, it's heavy. That's going to hurt and possibly kill me. So it's effective that way. But if I want to chop down a tree, I'd have better luck finding a herd of termites.
The fort served primarily as a transition point for supplies destined for Fort Cumberland, as there was no one remaining in the valley to protect. Ashby's Rangers was composed of mostly farmers, not professional soldiers. As a result, desertion and disciplinary problems continually plagued the operation of the fort. By fall 1757, the fort was abandoned and served in a reduced capacity during the remainder of military operations. The French and Indian War ended in 1763, and settlers began returning to the valley. Located at the junction of the main road from Fort Pleasant to the mouth of the Patterson Creek and the main road from Winchester to North Branch, the area around Fort Ashby was the site of considerable economic activity. The citizens of the area petitioned the state of Virginia to form the town of Frankfort. In December 1787, the town of Frankfort was chartered by Virginia. Later, the name would be changed from Frankfort to Alaska, then to Fort Ashby.
So originally in the 1700s it was called Frankfort, and then in 1787 they renamed it Frankfort, probably because of the three different forts that had been built here. And then in 1881, after Secretary of State Seward purchased Alaska, it became really popular across the country to rename towns over either popular people or popular events. So there were a lot of Alaskas that were named throughout the country, and there were two of them that were named that in West Virginia.
In 1794, Ashby's fort was utilized by General Washington during the Whiskey Rebellion. More than 1,500 soldiers commanded by General Morgan camped here while en route to suppress the Whiskey Rebellion in western Pennsylvania. In 1927, the Potomac Valley chapter of DAR purchased the fort from Mr. Tom Piles for $200. The fort had been used as a school as well as a residence. Through the assistance of the WPA, the fort was restored in 1938. The fort was officially opened for visitors on July 4th, 1939. The Potomac Valley chapter, NS DAR, dissolved in 1988, and the full ownership of the museum went to the Fort Ashby's chapter, NS DAR, which was formed in 1968 and became a co-owner of the fort and museum. Fort Ashby chapter NS DAR disbanded in November 2016 and no longer owns or maintains Ashby's fort. The deed was transferred to the museum. One of the striking features of the building is the double fireplace that is 14 feet wide and 4 feet thick. Numerous other woodwork and wrought iron metals date to the 18th century. On December 12, 1970, Ashby's fort was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. In 1998, an archaeological dig was done on the adjacent property. Numerous objects relating to the period were found, and the result of this project are still being evaluated. But today you can visit Ashby's fort in Fort Ashby, West Virginia, just outside of Cumberland, Maryland.
So we know that they had swivel guns because we found these. Otherwise, we didn't find the swivel guns themselves, but they left those here. And so swivel guns are small cannon that are placed on top of a bastion. Actually, they're initially naval guns, so they're on the sides of a ship, but they're easily adaptable to forts. You just drill a hole. It's got a pin that fits down into that hole, and then you can swivel the gun towards your target. And if you got hit by one of those, it would ruin your day.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they're pretty effective. And they would also put shot in front of it, so it would scatter.
Yeah.
did you guys excavate for? Whenever you're excavating, a couple months or weeks or?
So we've actually been doing archaeology for probably close to 20 years.
20, wow.
Now, it's usually a week per year. So our archaeologist will come, he'll set up, he'll do his dig for that week, and then he'll, put it in his bag, he'll write up his report, send it to us, and then come back the following year. So our archaeologist, his name is Stephen McBride. He's been amazing. We found, and it's not just about the artifacts, it's sort of digging down and finding the timeline, exactly when these things happened. You find things at different levels, so you can weed out the things that are from the 1800s or the early 1900s. Those were part of the story of this property, but the story of the French and Indian War was a little bit lower down, so it's fun to kind of watch that happen. And I was able to be there for a lot of this where, they would discover the post mold of the logs that were in the ground, so we know the exact outline of this fort.
Okay.
It was really cool to watch him do that. And when they get down to that level, they're using toothbrushes and tiny little scrapers. They're just taking off a few particles at a time, and then you get to that magic layer, and all of a sudden you don't see anything until you get there, and then all of a sudden you see the exact shape and size of the log that was sitting there, and it's clear as day. You can, if there were any undulations, you can see them. It's like an exact footprint of that log. So really, really cool. Yeah. So in here, we wanted to continue telling the stories of some of the characters involved in our story. So here we have a laundress. It's funny, for the men of the fort, for all the 32 rangers, we knew their names, their occupations, where they came from, their height, and even what color hair they had. For the women, they didn't even bother to write down their names.
Really?
Nothing.
Wow.
Zilch. Now, it's unfortunate. That's a sort of a sign of the times. Women were sort of second class. And now the women were usually related to the men at the fort. It could be a spouse, it could be a mother, it could be a daughter, depending on the age of the ranger. But they volunteered to be here. So, because if their husband was here, and it depended on their home situation. If they didn't have any children, and let's say the man was a shoemaker, what was the woman going to do at home? Just sort of cook for herself. So if she was able-bodied, she'd volunteer and go with her husband, and it's kind of a patriotic thing. Not all women were able to do that. If they had children at home, especially, that's number one priority. So she's going to be kind of watching out for the kids. So we set this up to sort of illustrate what it was like to do laundry using lye soap. And back then, to get blood stains or food stains out of clothing, they would use urine. It shows the dendrochronology. So as I explained earlier, we wanted to date this building to find out when it was built. So they use a drill like this that provides a core, and you can see the core sitting on top of that log. And you can use that to see the tree rings, and you go all the way to the center of the tree, and you can figure out by comparing it to a known local sample what year this tree was born and what the final year was when it was cut down. And they just take core samples right through the log. This is where one of them was done. So the lady from WVU who did this was so exact that she figured it was the fall of 1783 that these logs were cut down and then made into this building. So 1783 was at the very tail end of the Revolutionary War. Again, we don't think it had anything to do with the Revolutionary War. We think it was because of the continuing Indian wars in this area. But it's a big building for the time, especially out here. this would be way bigger than someone's cabin. And the upstairs could sleep 60 to 80 men. I mean, they would have been right next to each other on the floor on mats or blankets, but you could easily have fit that many upstairs. So that's way too big to be someone's house, at least out here. And over here, it's important to us to tell the entire story. So we want to tell the French side, the British side, the women, everything. So this represents Charles Bonine, and we know a lot about him because he was stationed at Fort Duquesne, and he wrote a diary, which later became a book, and it's still available today, which is really cool.
Okay.
And I recommend it if anybody wants to find out what it was like back then to live, especially from the French perspective. And he's a great writer. He writes in detail about all kinds of things that interest him, including plants and animals, but he also wrote about the Indians and the methods they used to trap beavers for their furs, things like that. And he goes on and on. And he was also the quartermaster, so he was responsible for getting supplies for the French at Fort Duquesne. And so he wrote a lot about the food that they ate, and they ate well, so we represented that here.
Wow.
And then behind him are all of these furs, and the furs are important because the French were trading with the Indians. The Indians would supply furs, which the French would send back to Europe by the boatload. I mean, it was a huge trade. It was sort of equivalent to the oil trade in today's economy. It was top of the list. So, and they would send back everything. We have beavers, we have fox, we have raccoon. This is a white ermine, bear skins, skunk, and of course, deer skins were also used. So pretty much anything, that had fur was going to be shipped back to Europe. Why were they so intensely interested in furs? Well, they'd hunted most of the fur-bearing animals out of Europe by that point in time.
Oh, really?
And so this was clothing, this was blankets, things to stay warm. Climate was colder back then too. In the 1770s, they had what they called locally the Little Ice Age. Now, we didn't have glaciers coming down, but it was cold. They had records of snow in June and July. And that's in this area. So, it was cold. So Europeans were desperate for anything that would help keep them warm. So the French would ship all these back, and in return, the Indians would get things that they couldn't make themselves, especially metal goods. So that included knives and tomahawks. And we think of tomahawks when they're at war, which is accurate. But boy, they could use them around camp as well, cutting down trees, making firewood, etc. So a very, very important tool that they had stone hatchets prior to Europeans arriving. But there's no comparison whatsoever. It would take you all day to cut down a tree with a stone hatchet. It's not very sharp. We have one in the other room I can show you.
Okay.
But when they got these metal steel hatchets, I mean, it was a game changer.
Oh, yeah.
So anything metal. So, and there were other things too, including guns, so they could hunt, but it was also, they could use them during battle as well, of course. So the Indians and the French had this terrific trade going on. And so that's another reason that they sided with the French, because French weren't trying to take their land, and they were great trading partners. So it's kind of a no-brainer for them.
Yeah.
Well, Cherokee arrow from the 1750s.
Okay.
It was donated to us by a gentleman in Virginia who had it passed down in his family for generations. It was just sort of mounted above his fireplace.
Really?
And he thought it would be better in a museum than sitting in his house. So, yeah, he just gave it to us. And one of the really cool things that the Cherokee figured out is they stopped using arrowheads.
Okay.
What they used in place were what you see in the floor below here are cut nails.
Oh.
They have rectangular heads. So the arrow itself is made from a reed, and which grow in swampy areas, which is very common where the Cherokee lived in southern Virginia and eastern Tennessee. And what they would do is they would cut a slot in the end of that arrow. They would put the rectangular nail head first into that slot, and then twist it a quarter turn, and that would lock it in place. And it's brilliant. And it's brilliant because arrows, it's just more efficient. It takes about 20 to 30 minutes if you're really good at chipping and napping an arrowhead. It would take me hours or maybe a day or something, but they were good at it. They knew how to do it. But why spend 20 or 30 minutes when you can cut a slash to the end of the arrow and stick a nail in and twist it? You're done.
Done. Yeah.
So it's just the Potomac River where Patterson Creek empties out. And right up here is Headsville, and this is where our sister fort, Fort Cock, was situated. So Washington helped survey all of this, and it was done by, the surveyor was James Jen. Washington was just an apprentice at that point. He was just learning how to survey. But that map is it's a photocopy, but this is an original map, this part of it.
Okay.
Now this stuff was added by our local historical society. This to me is like, this is hand drawn by James Jen in 1748. Read here or anything, it wouldn't survive.
Yeah.
But someone donated this to us. This is from the mid 1700s. And then most of the rest of the stuff in this case is original. These musket balls and shot were found here. So is this. This is a lead bar. And when lead oxidizes, it turns sort of a grayish white color. I didn't know that.
I didn't either. That's crazy.
Yeah. And someone even carved some initials or letters into it. We've tried to figure out, the initials don't match any of the rangers that were here. We don't know exactly what it means. And then we found lots of flint here. Now this is really interesting. The flint on the left, the amber colored flint, is French flint. The flint on the right, which is a much darker, almost black color, is English flint.
Okay.
Now, what's the difference? Well, British flint, just the rock that it comes from, is kind of unstable and it cracks a lot. So it's not really popular because the last thing you want to do is have to change a flint in the middle of battle, right? If you're hunting, it's one thing. There's no one shooting at you.
Right.
But French flint was much stronger, just the type of rock it was, that's all. And the French knew also which, there was sort of a grain that went along that rock, and the French knew to cut it a certain way, and it would be very, very strong. So when the flint hits the steel prison, which causes the spark that ignites the gun, a British flint would actually just chip away and then eventually crack, and then it's useless. But the French flint would go time after time. It was very reliable. So when we did archaeology here, for every British flint we found at least 9 French flints. So it was much more popular. But how were they getting French flints? You could go to any trading post and get it. Commerce is just like it is today. You can get anything you want, right? So they would go to a store, maybe a general store, maybe a trading post, and they would trade or pay for French flints, and they'd get a bag full. And then these were found here as well, side plate on the other side of the gun, and then the lock. And this is a trigger. And then these are bullet molds. And bullet molds were really important for the soldiers here. And it's a little different than it was for most of the Virginia Regiment. Virginia Regiment soldiers all were issued uniforms and weapons. The weapon was always a Brown Bess musket. And the Brown Bess was very effective. If it hit you, you were done, because it was a 75 caliber, if I'm not mistaken. Big musket ball. And Brown Bess guns were made in England in the closest setting to a factory that you can come. Back then, everything was handmade. They didn't have assembly lines like we think of with, cars, for example.
Sure.
But the British were starting to get really close to that. What they did is, in this factory, they had one guy, for example, making the part that was the trigger, and he made it the same way every time. And so he was an expert in making triggers. And then the next guy might make part of the lock assembly, and it was the same way every single time. So you could actually interchange a lot of these parts. So if a part went bad, I need a trigger. They'd give you a trigger, you take your lock apart, you put it in, you put it back together, and you're good to go. Yeah. But if you tried to do that with most guns, they're not even close.
Yeah.
So that was a smart, way of thinking about making their guns very fixable in the field. But here at Ashby's fort, we didn't have Virginia Regiment soldiers. In fact, they were told to bring their clothes home. That's what their uniform was, just whatever they wore from home. But the thing is, most of the people back then wore very natural colors because they dyed them with natural objects. So there were no like neon greens or anything like that. Everything was very natural colors. And my theory is that they wanted the Rangers, their goal was to go out and scout and find where the enemy was. So you had to kind of do it stealthily. Mm-hmm. So you're going through the woods. Well, if you wear Washington's uniform in the woods, you're going to stand out like a sore thumb. You're wearing blue and a bright red color. That's not natural. That's so, but if you're wearing an olive green or a brown or something like that, you're going to blend in really well.
Right.
And then getting back to the bullet molds, every man brought his own gun. They were not issued the Brown Bess guns. So whatever you had at home, and they all had something, because again, they had to hunt to get, if you wanted meat on the table, you couldn't go to a store and buy steaks like we can today. You had to go hunt. So depending on what size gun you had, you might have a 35 caliber, you might have a 40, you might have a 44, you might have a 50 caliber. So you had to have a bullet mold that matched the size of your gun. So they all brought their own bullet molds. They probably originally brought their own lead with them, and then they were probably issued more lead as the war went along. I'm sure they were. And they would make their own bullets and put them in their hunting pouch, and they're ready to go.
Thank you guys for checking out this video. And if you like this video and videos like this, please consider subscribing to the channel, liking this video, and sharing this video with your friends and family. A special thanks to Randy Crane, who helped tremendously with this video. His work at Fort Ashby and to preserve American history does not go unrecognized. And as always, remember to get out there and explore. And when you are exploring, visit the Fort Ashby Museum in Fort Ashby, West Virginia, just outside of Cumberland, Maryland, and see the content of this video firsthand. Thanks, guys.